Hello, folks. We're gonna introduce ourselves, I guess. I'm Nick Law. This is Zach Uchima. And we were asked to learn this song, and forgive us, we don't have a real sound system. We're gonna be just projecting and using our diaphragms. Yeah, we're happy to be here. I think this is a really amazing event. I'm learning a lot already just by listening to the speakers. And yeah, I thought this was a really great song choice, obviously. The book is Paved Paradise. But I just like kind of doing some research about this song. Tony Mitchell's such an amazing song. And I just find it amazing when a song like that is so popular in the nation. Talking about my home here in Hawaii. Urbanization is a pretty big problem, obviously. I thought it was cool to hear the story of the whole orange and seeing the parking lot, parking along one of my favorite mountain ranges here in Hawaii. And yeah, it's inspiring to hear the song and to learn more about this. Thank you guys so much for having us. Here's Paved Paradise. Projecting. Paved Paradise for the parking lot with a big hotel, boutique and a swinging hot spot. Don't you always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone. Paved Paradise for the parking lot. They took all the trees, put them in a tree museum, and they charged the people $1.50 just to see them. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone. Paved Paradise, put up a parking lot. Hey, far, put away the DDC now. Give me spots on my apples, even the birds and the bees. Please, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone. Paved Paradise, put up a parking lot. Late last night, I heard a screen door slam, and a big yellow taxi took away my old man. Yeah, no, you don't see me, cause you don't know what you got till it's gone. Paved Paradise, put up a parking lot. Y'all can sing too, y'all. No, you don't see me, cause you don't know what you got till it's gone. Paved Paradise, put up a parking lot. Wow, beautiful.
Aloha. How's everybody doing tonight? This is incredible considering how much rain, honestly. Thank you so much for coming. We were a little worried, to be honest. My name is Katie Rooney. I am the Director of Transportation Policy and Programs with the Lupono Initiative. We're kind of am I too loud? Okay, all right. Too spiky. Yeah, that happens. At the Lupono Initiative, we're a Hawaii-based impact firm that focuses on making Hawaii more sustainable and resilient. And what does that have to do with parking, you ask? Well, it turns out in the transportation sector, and so parking, your availability of it, its reform is really one of the big keys we have to making this sort of more sustainable multimodal transportation system that we all really, really want in this room, I'm assuming. So Henry's book came out last year, and just an amazing set of stories. It's got the mafia in it, it's got fist fights, it's got all sorts of things that sort of illustrate how crazy parking kind of makes us in this country. And it's a lovely imported concept we brought to Hawaii, right? So he has been around the country for the past year and just really excited to help elevate this topic. And really, I think, come on up, it's all yours. Senator who snuck in last minute to come and to grace us with your presence tonight. Thank you so much, and make sure you ask everybody else to come and look at this the video later.
Good evening. Let's give it up one more time for Nick and Zach. Right, that's kind of a tough act to follow. I'll do my best. Robert encouraged me to give this talk without slides. So I thought, how are they going to envision what I'm talking about? So you're just going to have to imagine a big parking lot. How are you going to imagine this without my 100 slides in the parking lot? Well, you're going to have to use your imagination. So 2 decades ago, Donald Shoup, who is the Pope of parking studies, observed that thinking about parking seems to take place in the reptilian cortex of the brain, which is the part of the brain that's said to govern territoriality, aggression, and ritual display. And I think that cognitive science has moved on from this concept of the reptilian cortex, but clearly it remains true for parking. We are fiercely attached to our parking spots, whether those spots are in a home driveway, an office garage, or a surf spot, as I have quickly learned. We are attached to our parking spots, even if our possession of them is momentary and only lasts until the next time we get in the car. And we are so parking brained that when the President of the United States argued that the G7 summit should be held at his Miami area resort, the first justification he gave was, there's ample parking. But it wasn't enough. You get a neat illustration of this obsession in the parts of the country where it snows. So in Chicago, where I was living when I was working on this book, there's a blog called Chicago Dibs that collects the fantastic array of objects that are used to save parking spots in Chicago that have been shoveled out after a snowstorm. And if you walk around Chicago after a snowstorm, you will see this for yourself, that when people drive to work, the spots they've shoveled out are filled with all manner of strange household objects, like children's basketball hoop or an Tiffany figurine or lawn chair or something like that. And I've always imagined that the implication of these objects, you would be beaten with that if you were to try and take that parking spot. So, and in fact, in Boston, where I live now, when the mayor tried to limit this practice of saving spots to the 48 hours after a snowstorm, a city councilman protested. And he said, the issue speaks to the basic principle of what it means to be an American. He said, like the gold miner and the pioneers, residents have a right to stake their claims. And it's hard to think of another aspect of city government where there's an endorsement of vigilante justice, but that's like exactly what this is. So tonight, I submit to you that the pursuit of a good parking space has become a primary determinant of this country's architecture, urbanism, and environment. And what do I mean by good? I mean, it's convenient to you to where you're going, ideally 5 feet from the door of the business or your house. I mean, it's available the second you arrive for you to pull into, ideally even without backing in. And I mean, it's free, right? Which is the third key attribute that we demand from the perfect parking space. Now, this These three attributes, convenient, available, and free, constitute a trilemma, which is to say, you can never achieve all three of them without destroying the place that you wanted in the first place. And there's no shortage of of examples of that. So this expectation, convenient, available, free, has poisoned our ability to manage this resource in a more sensible way. And the preoccupation with parking, as I'm sure you have experienced in your own lives, is often the first objection raised at a neighborhood meeting at the prospect of a new business opening up or new neighbors moving in. Parking concern freezes our geography, pushes new development and sprawl at the fringes of our cities. In response to this demand, we have made these codes, which are on the books in almost every American city, including here in Honolulu. And they make it illegal to build homes, offices, or shops without parking. Now, we'll get to Honolulu in a second. There's some exceptions to that, which are important. But these statutes are typically known as parking minimums or parking requirements. And they make housing expensive, they make buildings uglier and further apart, damage the environment, they destroy walkable neighborhoods, and they've made some American downtowns more than half parking by land area. Why have we become dependent on the automobile for our most basic tasks? I submit to you that the answer is in part the decisions we've made about how to store the car, which is a need that has eaten up the public right-of-way and private property alike. As you now know, I drew the title of this book from Joni Mitchell's song, Big Yellow Taxi. She wrote a famous lyric about the construction of a parking lot right here in Oahu. And she meant it as a lament that we had demolished something precious without realizing it. But I see the book as having a second meaning, in which paved is not a verb describing what happened to paradise, the direct object. It's an adjective describing paradise. But the idea that actually most of our policy for the last 70 years, has been designed to create as much parking as possible. And so the paved paradise has actually been the intent. It's a paved paradise by design. Now, everybody loves a good parking space, don't get me wrong, myself included. But there are things we love more about our cities. There are things we want more than parking. Things like affordable housing, attractive architecture, walkable neighborhoods, conservation of natural land, and a more sustainable way of life. And what I wish to suggest to you tonight is that the preoccupation with parking is directly impairing our ability to provide those things, to build the city and the society and the surf spots that we actually want, even more than we want that parking space. So, how did we get here? The parking problem is as old as the road itself, but it got a lot more complicated after the invention of the automobile, and in particular, the automobile that could be stored all night outside for days at a time. One woman in the 1920s, Muncie, Indiana, said that she had bought a car before she installed indoor plumbing because you can't go to town in a bathtub. And that speaks to America's immediate and enthusiastic adoption of this new mode of transportation. What followed were 4 decades of intense traffic jams as cars swarmed downtown streets. There was incessant gridlock in pretty much every US city, and experts believed that the root of the traffic problem was parking. That cars would drive downtown and they would either circle endlessly looking for a parking spot, or they would simply give up and double park, or even triple park. And this practice was quickly eliminating our rights of way as thoroughfares and leading to interminable congestion. And so by the end of World War II, everyone is convinced that parking is not only a serious problem, but actually poses a threat to the health of the city. I found a cartoon in the Los Angeles Times from 1945 that shows this hulking gorilla figure looming over downtown Los Angeles, and the gorilla is portrayed as the downtown parking problem. And I heard from some people that you can find quotes from downtown business leaders that to the effect that parking is the largest single issue facing central business districts of large cities at this time. So there's a tremendous amount of focus on how to rescue cities from this parking crisis before they are subsumed by the threat from the suburbs, the threat of decentralization, threat of people leaving for ample parking day and night, as the South Park theme song puts it. And so cities and communities, small towns as well, chose to respond to this threat by increasing the parking supply. They used urban renewal to create huge parking lots. They spent public money building giant downtown garages. And of course, they made a seismic change to our zoning codes, requiring every building to have its own parking lot. They felt they had to because the cost of building that parking was so much higher than the public's willingness to pay for it. And unless it was required, nobody would build it. And now you can understand what planners were thinking when they proposed these changes to the code. They thought, we'll let the private sector take care of this problem for us. Instead of city tax dollars funding tax-exempt garages for suburbanites, we could let developers fix the parking problem. In fact, they would be forced to. They would be forced to build the parking themselves. And so nearly every city adopted these long, complex codes. How many parking lots have to every single use. Parking buildings, schools, donut shops, nail salons, and nunneries. Should I speak more down?
I think we should maybe try this one.
Can I come over there?
Maybe. I don't know, isn't it weird? How about this? Is this weird? Try turning that off and coming here, and then we'll move this plant. Or we'll actually move all the plants around you. So you're kind of being devoured by plants. No, for some reason the lav mic is cutting in and out a little bit.
How about that? Is that better? If you missed what I said earlier, you got to buy the book. So parking codes were the last step that cities took to address this perceived parking shortage, perceived parking problem with the parking supply. And they applied to every single land use, donut shops, nunneries, nail salons, apartment buildings, shops, offices, etc. And they're really, really specific. Like in the Big Island where we just were talking to people about parking, they've got a provision in the code that requires 4 parking spaces for every lane in a bowling alley. So that's $20,000 in parking, surface parking, for every single lane. So if you want to open a bowling alley with 20 lanes, you do the math, you're spending, what, $400,000 just to build a giant surface parking lot to get your bowling alley open. More importantly, that's 1,200 square feet of space. So it also means that your transit, pedestrian-oriented bowling alleys really are inachievable on Hawaii. Now, you might say that's not the reason Hawaii doesn't have lots of bowling alleys. There's lots of other stuff to do here. But this type of policy exists across the United States, not just here in Hawaii. And that kind of micromanagement requires acres and acres of parking to accompany all these different land uses. Now, planners don't actually know that, for example, an adult bookstore, to take one example, requires 4, 6, or 8 parking spots. How many people drive to an adult bookstore depends on many things, but in particular on urban context for our conversation tonight. And parking planners have made urban context irrelevant in the design of our buildings, very much by design. I'm going to run through some of the misguided consequences of this approach in a moment, but let us first admit that when it came to creating parking, these laws worked wonders. They created so much parking that few Americans had to pay to park at home or at work, and fewer still spend more than a few seconds finding a parking spot. And they established suburban parking standards in almost every city in America. So I just need to underline for you just how much parking we've built. In Los Angeles County, for example, there are 19 million parking spots. That's 5 for every single household. It's 14% of the unincorporated land in the county. And it's more land than the moving lanes on the streets and the freeways put together. In Silicon Valley, which is the wealthiest region of the United States, parking is 13% of the land. There's 15 million spots in the Bay Area, which is enough to wrap a parking lane around the earth twice. And the smaller the city, the more parking there is. Seattle has 5 parking spots per household. Des Moines, Iowa has 20 per household. And pure parking parcels make up 28% of land in Louisville and 30% of Albuquerque. And this is just parking lot parcels. This doesn't include parking inside buildings, underneath buildings, or curb parking. And that's what a real parking problem looks like. As a result, we've built 3 parking spaces, at least 3 parking spaces for every car in this country. Even in neighborhoods that claim to toil under a parking shortage, studies usually show that there's 45% more spaces than necessary to accommodate the peak parking demand. And so it should be no surprise that we use more land in this country for storing each car than we do for housing each person. Forcing the private sector to take care of car storage had some unpleasant, unforeseen side effects. And this is for 3 reasons: cost, space, and law. First, let's talk about the cost of building parking. A stall in a Honolulu garage will cost upwards of $50,000 to build. Even a surface lot generally costs $5,000 a space in a rural area. Maintaining the road network, including the aisles of free parking along every street, costs money too. And you don't think you pay for that parking, but you do. It's in your tax bill, it's in your receipts, and most of all, it's in your rent. A project in Austin, Texas that I visited with formerly homeless veterans, you could see this trade-off very clearly. They had to build a parking space for every unit and more for the staff and for visitors. But of course, these formerly homeless veterans didn't have very high rates of car ownership. And so as you visited, which I did one Wednesday night, I found that the garage was mostly empty. And that was a case where there was a literal trade-off. We're pouring all this asphalt to build this unused garage. Every dollar that went into that asphalt was a dollar that didn't go into making new apartments for homeless people in Austin. The trade-off is very real. Low-income housing in California faces the same issue. Structured parking accounts for more than a quarter of the cost of building. If you don't drive, you're paying for that parking for those who do. The second way that this affects what we build is space. A parking spot is typically thought to be 300 square feet with ingress and egress, which is nearly the size of a small studio apartment. So on a small lot, a developer won't even have room to build the parking required for small multifamily building, even if she could afford it. Furthermore, architects usually operate within strict zoning envelopes for how big buildings can be. So more parking also takes the place of more housing in spatial terms, not just in financial terms. And finally, parking is like eggs. You can't build just one parking space. They come in rows. And to unlock economies of scale, parking has to be built floor by floor. And the third is law. Parking mandates, these rules in the zoning codes, require builders to build for the maximum amount of drivers who might ever show up. So it's too much, and it's too much by design, and it's separated between different uses, even if they require parking at different times of day. And you can see a demonstration of this overbuilding on Black Friday, which is supposed to be the busiest shopping day of the year. But if you go to a parking lot on Black Friday, and this is a sort of a meme that you'll see on Twitter and Facebook, people will take photos just to show that even on the busiest day of the year, these lots are overbuilt. And again, all by design. And by the way, this is true of residential garages in Honolulu as well, studies have shown. So keep these factors in mind: cost, space, and design, and consider how they affect different aspects of the city. For example, the type of housing that gets built. As a result of these requirements, we have simply stopped building small buildings. Parking requirements help to trigger an extinction level event for infill apartment buildings like row houses, brownstones, triple deckers, and so forth. Production of buildings with 2 to 4 units fell more than 90% between 1971 and 2021. Developers have instead gravitated either towards larger projects, which can justify the expense of a structured garage, or sprawl, where the land is cheap enough for a 3-car garage. They have gravitated towards higher cost units to pay off the expense of parking, and they've gravitated towards units with fewer bedrooms, which require less parking. So our laws limit housing and require parking, and as a result, we have a parking surplus and a housing shortage. A second consequence of making the parking spot as obligatory as the front door has been in architecture. For a century, American architecture has evolved in tandem with these increasing parking requirements, as these laws have forced developers to move from the early 20th century vernacular, corner taverns, storefront groceries, row houses, 3 flats, etc., to fast food chains, big box stores, and houses whose primary architectural feature is the garage door. The American architect Louis Sullivan said form followed function, but parking scholar Don Shoup says form follows parking requirements. And this system has made it impossible to build a traditional American Main Street. Central parcels there were originally developed as commercial storefronts facing the sidewalk, with offices or even housing above. Put 20 or 30 of them side by side and you have your traditional American Main Street. But if you wanted to open a drugstore or a florist on one of those lots in an American city today, you need to provide a parking spot for every 250 square feet of interior space. And if a parking spot is 300 square feet, you're already building more parking by square footage than you are florist, drugstore, or a restaurant, what have you. If you want to build a 2-story shop, you need to provide even more parking. And at 3 stories, your lot is basically a totem of a building inside a sea of parking. Some towns in Hawaii require 2 parking spots with every unit of housing. So if you want to build some low-cost multifamily housing in Hilo or Lihue, you're going to have to tear down a neighboring structure to build that parking, despite the ample surplus of parking in those places, as we saw. So this also makes it impossible to renovate historic structures. One architect described to me buildings in her town locked up behind a parking padlock without enough parking to be given new life. Now, I don't think planners meant to make Main Street obsolete or illegal or extinct when they started requiring so much parking. But sometimes, as Joni says, you don't know what you got until it's gone. Which brings me to a third consequence of this post-war parking status quo, which is, of course, transportation. Because all this parking is a dish that makes us hungry for more parking. Parking forces us to drive more, and the more we drive, the more parking we crave. In the early days, certainly, parking facilities rose in response to demand. But later, thwarting the desires of planners who decided to require all this parking, they began to create demand. Study after study has confirmed this cause and effect relationship between parking and driving and car ownership at the level of homes, offices, or commercial districts. And it's not hard to see why. Free parking is a huge incentive. You pay for it whether you drive or not, and the subsidy given out to drivers in this country in the form of free parking runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars every year. But parking changes our transportation habits in another way. It degrades the urban environment to the extent that walking, biking, or using mass transit becomes difficult or dangerous or inconvenient, because buildings that propel each other like magnets in the sea of parking are hard to walk between. Driveways cut up the sidewalk, and nobody likes walking through parking lots. Americans think they are deciding how to get around for themselves, but parking has a heavy finger on the scales. And then finally, after housing affordability, architecture, and transportation, our parking decisions have had a terrible effect on the environment. There are the carbon emissions from all driving, which have helped make transportation the country's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. There is local particulate pollution. I don't need to tell you today, of all days, as we hear the rain pick up outside, that all of this parking creates a stormwater flooding problem as we pave over natural land with impervious surface and force our sewer system to bear the full weight of every rainstorm. A lack of groundwater replenishment and aquifers is the flip side of this situation. And then finally, parking is a huge contributor to the urban heat island effect. It's obviously a hostile environment for birds and bugs. And meanwhile, the production of concrete and asphalt to build all this parking consumes massive amounts of energy and materials. And the sedentary lifestyles created by environments where the most basic human activity, walking from A to B, has been rendered nearly impossible. By consigning so much of our most valuable land to one use and one use only, the free storage of private automobiles, we have so thoroughly foreclosed the prospect of another city that it can be hard to even imagine what might have been. But this is the part where I tell you not to despair. It sounds bad, I know. But things are changing for the better. In the spring of 2020, for reasons that need not be gone into here, city planners and restaurants simultaneously came to the realization that all this space that had been previously reserved for parking and in fact considered essential to small business survival might not be so essential after all. Seating areas blossomed in parking lots and curb spaces nationwide. And I remember what it was like in New York City that summer when everybody sat outside for the first time. It was the most transformative change to the public urban environment in New York since cars parked on the street in the first place. In some ways, it was a superficial change. New York City's curbside restaurant program, the biggest change to the streetscape, certainly in my lifetime, it only took 6,000 parking spaces out of a total of 3 million in the city. But it contained the seed of a deeper revelation. The demand for parking is not fixed, it's flexible. And for a moment, you could begin to imagine what else we might do with all this land. Many towns and even a few states have now realized it doesn't make sense to require parking of new homes or new businesses, especially when you consider that in a couple of decades, it's possible that autonomous vehicles won't need all this prime parking space at all. So what happens when they get rid of these rules? When I set out to write this book, just 2 US cities had repealed parking minimums: Hartford, Connecticut, and Buffalo, New York. But over the past 5 years, this reform has caught fire, including here in Honolulu, which repealed parking requirements for Oahu's most urbanized areas way back in 2020. And now we're beginning to see, is all this parking simply the result of preference, a nation of drivers manifesting our priorities in the architecture and development? Or has it been jammed into the urban environment by the hidden force of law? With a few experiments under our belt, we can now say that these laws did indeed force builders to pour billions of dollars in concrete for parking that will never be used. And they continue to do so in some parts of Hawaii and in most of the United States, perpetuating the endless cycle of more parking and more traffic. Take Seattle. After the city let developers decide how much parking to build in 2012, they mostly did choose to build parking. It's America after all. But between 2012 and 2017, they built 17,000 fewer spaces than the old laws would have required. And at the going rate of a Seattle garage, that's a savings of $500 million in parking structures. That's in one city over 5 years. And it's not just that the housing becomes cheaper to build. Different types of housing become possible. When Miami relaxed its parking minimums a few years ago, small townhouse developments began to crop up in the city's core neighborhoods. In Tempe, Arizona, cul-de-sac is a new project with no parking at all. The first time housing without parking has been built in the Phoenix area in decades, possibly in a century. When California stopped requiring accessory dwelling units to include their own parking spaces, tens of thousands of garages were converted into granny flats and backyard cottages. And this is not just true in walkable city cores either. When I was reporting my book, I talked to an office portfolio manager named David Cunningham, whose firm owns millions of square feet of office space across the Sun Belt. He owns office in places like Atlanta, Dallas, right? Not particularly walkable place. It's far out in the suburbs. And he actually counted how many of his parking spaces were full before the pandemic, keep in mind. And he found that his garages were never more than half occupied. And his firm alone had spent $100 million just on the empty parking spaces, not even on the full ones. And now he assigns fewer parking spaces to each tenant and builds less parking overall. And this kind of reform is popular. I talked to a developer in Charlotte, North Carolina, who described how he approached city councils about this subject. And he said when he goes to a liberal town, he talks about housing affordability and the environment and walkable neighborhoods, and those are all winning issues. But then he goes to a conservative place, and this type of change is popular there too, because he says, you're gonna let the government tell you how many parking spaces to build? Of all the things that the government could be imposing on your property rights? And I think that's one of the reasons this reform has proven so popular. But now I know you're asking, what happens to the drivers? Are we moving back into a world of pre-war parking chaos? It turns out, so far the answer is no. Drivers are fine, and that's in part because we have to work our way through our excess parking before we come close to having a shortage. But it's also because if we reorient our municipal policy away from building more parking, we can make decisions that in turn reduce the need for parking. Instead of focusing on the supply of parking, like our mid-century predecessors, we can focus on the demand for parking. Because trying to build your way out of a parking shortage, whether in a downtown, residential neighborhood, or a surf spot, is enormous costs. It often creates new demand that fills up those spots the moment they appear. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this talk, it's this. Demand for parking is more flexible than you think. How many cars each household buys, and how often they drive them, depends on how much parking you build and how much you charge for it. People who have less parking own fewer cars and are more likely to use mass transit, walk, or bike. As the chief of staff in Chicago put it to me of the city's priorities, if your number one concern is traffic and your number one objective is parking, you need to understand that those two things are at cross purposes. I know everyone here is concerned about parking at the beach, as I learned this morning in my HPR interview. So I'm gonna give you an example from the beach. Here's a beach town, Seaside, Florida. It's on the Florida Panhandle. It's got beautiful white sand beaches on the Gulf of Mexico. And it's famous for its tight-knit anti-sprawl design. But it also does a good job with parking. Most people park their cars on the curb, so the houses don't have that blank-faced wall of garage door. The streets are narrow, and they're paved with brick and lined with big trees and parked cars, which makes drivers go slow. And that, in turn, makes them feel comfortable for kids on bicycles or for parents with strollers. Furthermore, the businesses downtown in Seaside aren't required to have their own parking. Instead, they share parking, which reduces operating costs, gets customers out on their feet, and preserves the district's walkable feel. But Seaside's Achilles heel with respect to parking was that for a long time, all their public parking was free. Town Square was essentially a giant parking lot, and that meant people would circle round and round in their big SUVs looking for parking. And parents had to keep a close eye on their kids because of all those circling cars. During COVID, however, Seaside was all but empty, and the town took that opportunity to turn the parking lot into a plaza. People loved it. Andre Swanee, one of the town planners, told me he had always hated that central square. But after the cars were moved out, he said it was like Cinderella. Kids playing soccer, older people riding bicycles, cafe tables spilling into the plaza. And even after visitors returned to Seaside, the town decided to keep that parking lot plaza. That was possible because they had started charging for parking elsewhere in the town. And what they did was they charged a price that ensured there was always a space available for the next driver who arrived. And they changed the price to make sure that it would not be too much to push people away if the lot was empty, but if the lot was full, they would raise the price to create empty spaces. And when they did this, they found that their demand for parking was more flexible than they had anticipated. For example, families with teenagers used to drive their own cars, each kid in his own car. Now they just came in one. And all that is possible with a parking charge. Visitors who wanted to just go to the beach, meanwhile, could park further away where the parking was free. And others came to town on their bicycles, which was nicer because there was less traffic than there was before. This transformation depended on a technology that was invented 100 years ago, which is of course, the parking meter. Now, that's what you, boo, yes, I know. Too often, contemporary city planners forget the original purpose of the parking meter, which was not to raise money or to sock it to the motorist, but it was to manage and organize this precious interface between streets and buildings, between transportation and land use, to sort drivers according to how long they needed to park and how much they wanted to pay. The inventor of the parking meter looked out his window in Oklahoma City in 1935, and he saw that all the best parking spots were taken by employees of downtown businesses who got there first thing in the morning and parked all day. And he found that the actual clients of those businesses and people who were coming for a meeting or to buy something would show up and they would say there was nowhere to park, and then they would go and park at the mall, take their business elsewhere. And he realized that with parking meters, you could, instead of everybody competing for the same 40 spots on Main Street, you could sort people according to how long they needed to park. And the cost of walking a few blocks to their place of employment for employees would be amortized
over the 10 hours they plan to spend in the district. And this is still the same way it works with parking meters. Long-term parkers pay less and they park a little further away and they walk more, while short-term parkers pay more and walk less and park right in front of their destination. So getting this right has never been more crucial because it's precisely the places where parking is genuinely difficult. Cities like this one, where it's possible to live a satisfying car-free life. So it's precisely the places where the challenge is greatest when it comes to parking politics that we must push hardest to make these changes. And make no mistake, as zoning for parking vanishes from the city codes of places like Honolulu, easing the way for infill housing, affordable housing, senior housing, walkable retail, new business, and so on, demand for the curb will increase. And there are two sources of this pressure. First is the fact that long neglected curbside real estate is suddenly in high demand for anything besides long-term car storage. And in this category, we might put deliveries, food trucks, taxis doing pickup and drop off, but also non-car uses of the curb lane, like bus lanes, bike lanes, pedestrian safety improvements, green space, restaurant patios, public space more generally. And all of this is to say nothing of the challenge posed by electrification infrastructure for people who park their cars on the curb and need access to charging equipment. All of these uses are more important in social, environmental, or financial terms than parking, and more valuable. Second, as cities begin to build more housing with less parking and rising real estate values claim surface parking lots, cities will have to contend with spillover parking and its discontents. And both of these projects, the revival of traditional urban forms and the reclamation of the public right-of-way, are exciting, but they are also dependent on our ability to properly manage parking and avoid the backlash that quashes this virtuous cycle of walkable urbanism before it starts. Now, the good news is we have a lot of new technology. We're not putting up the old-fashioned parking meter anymore. We can change the price we charge for the curb based on demand or the purpose of a trip or the size of a vehicle. We can charge different prices to locals and tourists, as I learned when I paid $50 to park in downtown Kona. Happily, I might add. Just kidding. We can choose how to spend that money on transit service or local street trees or district-wide garages, and we can rethink the structure of parking fines, charging more to frequent offenders and making sure that violators don't get stuck in a cycle of revenue-driven policing. We can also automate parking enforcement with pay-by-play technology. And we can reserve curb space for priority users, such as people with disabilities or delivery trucks. We have new information about how parking is used and by whom and for how long. We have new ways to buy parking, reserve parking, share parking, and lease out unused spaces. We can let people block their own driveways to make the most of the parking supply in residential neighborhoods. We can require employers to stop subsidizing employee parking or landlords to unbundle parking from leases. We can change the way we distribute parking permits, grandfathering in existing privileges while letting new residents pay the market price for storing their private property in the public right-of-way. So when I was working on this book, I talked to somebody about the parking industry, and he said, parking is like a one-fleet airline. And you ask the guys in charge of the airline, is Jimmy on the plane? I don't know. How much did Jimmy pay? I don't know. Where's the plane going? I don't know. That used to be the parking industry. They had no sense of how many people were coming in and out of the garage, how long they were staying, etc. But that's changed now. That should not be the case anymore. We have the technology, we have an incredible amount of information about how parking is used, and we can adjust our policies accordingly. Since I published this book 1 year ago, I've spoken with politicians and planners in dozens of cities about the parking problem. And I'm going to present to you my very technical analysis of what's going on. It's basically a trolley problem. You may be familiar with this philosophical conundrum in which a trolley is running down a track and it stands on its current trajectory to run over 5 people who are tied to the tracks. This is a trolley in the Wild West, I guess. And then there's another track the trolley can go on, but there's only one person tied to the tracks. And you're at the switch, and you have the power to push the switch and send the trolley down the track where it kills 1 person instead of 5 people. And that's basically the parking situation, bear with me. The current trajectory we're on, the 5 people on the tracks, that's sprawl, high housing costs. Preventing the reuse of historic structures, preventing the formation of new businesses, environmental waste, and all that. Everyone knows the status quo is not good. But the top track, which requires managing parking, pricing parking, is a difficult political decision to make. Nobody wants the responsibility for that change. And it's the responsibility of making this shift from a trajectory that we know is bad to one that requires some political courage that is holding elected officials back. And so the stakes of managing the curb correctly this time around are high to avoid the parking chaos that set this vicious cycle of parking, driving, and more car-dependent land use into motion a century ago. Because there is also a virtuous cycle. If we were to take some of this parking and do something else with it, there would be so many more things. Schools, cafes, gyms, parks, stores, you name it, within walking distance. If we get this right, we can unleash a virtuous cycle of safer streets, transportation alternatives, and housing near jobs and amenities. Permits growth without additional demands on the parking supply. New neighbors without more traffic. We can create tiny parklets, patches of public space where people can gather and meet their friends. We can use the space dedicated to parking and make it easier, safer, and faster for people to walk, bike, and use mass transit. We can build bike lanes because no one should die riding a bike. And this is especially important at a moment when the electric bike is unlocking this form of low carbon, low cost mobility for a whole new population. We can build bus lanes so that commuters have an incentive to leave the car at home. And we can build bump outs around crosswalks to preserve sight lines for drivers and make intersections safer for pedestrians. We can plant trees to shade the street, and we can restore patches of native grassland, which will draw in bugs and birds, clean and cool the air, and soak up stormwater before it floods people's houses. We can stop the NIMBYism of Americans who see their new neighbors first and foremost as a threat to their parking spaces, which they do. We can unlock new housing types so that seniors can age in place and young adults can move out of their parents' houses, finally. We can build an environment where people with disabilities who don't drive can navigate life's needs independently. With better parking policy, we can restore a sense of choice to both housing and transportation in this country, where for far too long, there has been only one thing on the menu. Cars are amazing. Don't get me wrong. I love to drive. They represent freedom and they feel like it most of the time. But the inability to get around any other way is a kind of prison. Parking subsidy, meanwhile, is nice. But car dependency is a tax. It forces most Americans to put a rising share of their incomes into purchasing, fueling, maintaining, and insuring 2.2 automobiles per household. Half of all trips in the United States are under 3 miles. It's a distance that could be covered on an electric bike or even on foot. Change is possible, even without a Tokyo quality mass transit system. And the promise of this reform is not to punish drivers, it's to liberate them. Because without parking baked into our streets and our architecture, how many more people could live in walkable places? How many more car-dependent places, free from parking law, could blossom into neighborhoods where people could ride bikes, where kids could walk to school, where a family with 3 cars could get by with 2, and a family with 2 cars could get by with just 1. In that world, it would be easier, not harder, to find a spot, although you might have to pay for it. And it would be much easier to live in a place where you would not need to drive quite so often. Adults could walk to the grocery store. That's so much to ask. In a world with better parking, there might be fewer places to park, but in place of those old parking spaces would emerge a city so much richer and fuller and fairer that we would not think twice about what we have lost. Thank you.
So we're good? Okay. We're going to transition to the Q&A now. Thank you so much, Henry. if you have a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand and I can come up to you with the mic. They're all in the middle.
Do I need this? Why everyone can take theater in high school. So, before you mentioned a couple of things that she just talked about, reducing or eliminating minimum parking requirements, dynamic pricing for parking meters. I want to mention another thing that was an idea generated by the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Commission in Sunnyvale, California, in the Silicon Valley, that I think would really work here in Honolulu, where there's a bizarre parking thing I've never seen anywhere else. They proposed a prioritization of the public right-of-way. And they said mobility uses should have higher priority. And yet that means sidewalks, bike lanes, and car lanes should have priority over stationary uses, which was landscaping and parking. And the city council adopted it. Really clever idea. You've probably noticed here in Honolulu, you can be driving along a lane and all of a sudden parking spaces appear in the lane, and that's the end of that lane. You jump out of a lane because all of a sudden, one parked car fills the lane of traffic. You think of all the hundreds of people who go down that lane, and one person's free vehicle storage in the public right of way shuts that down. So the bike and pedestrian advocates, they came up with a real creative idea of prioritizing the public right of way. And when we thought about that as a possible additional remedy besides what we already said.
That's a great point, right? It all depends on where you are, really, because I think in a lot of cities, it's true that certainly the demand for movement on, especially for non-car users, actually needs that space that's currently being used by parking. And so it's not just that free parking and ample parking discourages people from using alternate means of getting around, but also that it physically takes up the space that could be used to make it possible for people to safely get from A to B some other way. That said, I also think that there is some sense in which curb parking is a valuable resource in certain places. I think in places where you have a fairly car-dependent place with lots of people who actually do drive to local businesses, then it is important maybe to keep that interface between the street and the business. And it preserves something else, right? Which is it preserves a feeling of safety on the sidewalks because pedestrians have a buffer zone between them and the moving traffic. And this is also true for bike lanes, right? Parking protected bike lanes have become a popular way of designing the street in some places.
Except for the fact that, as I've learned from the cyclists, the word door is now a verb. Did you hear Bob got doored the other day? He's driving a light line next to those parked cars and someone throws open and grabs that door. It isn't actually that safe, although I take your point about it.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. We have a couple questions over here.
Thank you, Henry. That was a really great talk. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, the kind of entry is getting rid of the minimum parking requirement and letting the market determine how much parking to actually provide. What do you see as the viability of actually having parking maximums and maybe some of the impacts, unintended or otherwise, of that?
That's a great question. So some cities have taken these parking minimums. They used to require a certain amount of parking with each use and just said that number now represents the maximum. We used to require 40 parking spaces with your 20 units of housing, but now we're going to say you cannot build more than 40 parking spaces with those 20 units of housing. And I think that can be a pretty productive policy in walkable places that genuinely do not need more parking. Like Manhattan, where I'm from, parking gets built as a luxury good. for luxury apartments. And all it does is raises the cost of those units and pushes more cars onto the street in a place where you really, truly do not need a car to get around and go about your life. And I think parking maximums in a place like that are a great idea. I think you'd want to look at how much parking people are actually building once you got rid of these rules. And then you'd have to figure out if you can navigate the political headwinds that come with imposing these rules, right? Because developers will tell you sometimes they didn't want to build all the way to the minimum, but they do need to build some parking in order to be able to get their mortgage lender comfortable. So that's a risk. Mexico City is an example of a place that decided to get rid of their minimums and impose maximums, and they had to undo the maximums because developers pushed back. Now, you might say that doesn't matter, we should just impose the policy we want to have and create the city we want to have, which is, I think, a valid argument. But again, you don't want to create rules that create a bunch of housing that no one wants to necessarily.
Hi, thank you. I love almost everything. I want to push a little bit more on the beaches and have you said surf spots. I guess I have a two-part question. So the first part of my question is just of your case studies and analyses, what proportion were for surfing? So like with surfboards, canoes, foils, versus just people going to the beach? Because I think those are categorically different.
That's a great point. Is that the whole thing you wanted to ask, the second part too?
First, I just want to know that one.
Well, it's true that Seaside, Florida is not famous for its surf, so that is an issue. But it's not to say that people don't come to the beach loaded up with things to carry. I mean, people come with chairs and coolers and all sorts of other things to carry. So I don't think it's particularly unique. And of course, yeah. So I haven't done a full analysis of surf spot parking problems yet. But,
yeah, so I guess my follow-up question was just if you think maybe the jury is out on ocean recreation as something that's categorically different than other uses.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think I think I would just reframe the problem a little bit and say, from what I understand, there seems to be a shortage of parking at places where everybody wants to go. Now, what is the solution to that problem? You have two options, as far as I can see, or three options. Either you maintain the status quo and people arrive at 10 a.m. with the whole family in the car and they find they can't park and their day at the beach has to be canceled or relocated or something like that. That's the status quo. Option B is you double the size of the parking lot and you bulldoze a bunch of palm trees and you paved paradise, for lack of a better word. Now, it's possible that when you do that, those 20 parking spots will soon be taken up by 20 more drivers who are going to that beach. And then the 41st person shows up and they're looking for a parking spot and there's nothing in there. So I think that's kind of the dilemma you're facing. And I think the third option is you try and manage that demand. And I don't think that anybody's going to walk 5 miles with a surfboard on their head, to be clear. But I think one thing that we realized as people have experimented with paying for parking is people do change their habits in response to these queues. And if what this means is that certain hours of the day fill up and other times the price is cheaper, or maybe you have people who can carpool, right? And you see what happens. I think one of the things that's attractive about parking policy as a lever is that it's so flexible. And you actually can say, okay, we're going to see what happens if we charge $1 an hour just at the busiest time of day, just to force people, maybe nudge them in a direction where there's less demand for those parking spaces. And if it doesn't work, you can always cancel it. So I think there's a lot you can experiment with, but I'm certainly not the world's foremost expert on surfing parking.
We have a question back here.
Actually, I had two comments. One, I wanted to thank you for be on public radio this afternoon because I heard you and it got me to come. And I wish you had been around when I was the mayor of the city council. Because I was the guy, or a bunch of us championed reducing the minimums. And it's interesting, developers would come to me and complain about, it costs so much to build a high rise. These are condominium high rises. So you gotta give us some forgiveness, we can make the money that we need to make. And they talk about parking being expensive to build. So when you reduce the minimum, they came back and said, we don't like this, because when we sell a unit, the market expects 2 parking stalls per unit. And now you're making it harder for us to sell the units. So it's interesting, they complained with all the cost of building and parking costs. But at the same time, they said they would have a harder time selling the unit with the requirement that they only have to build 1 parking stall. I don't know, do you have any comments to that? Have you heard that in other jurisdictions?
That's interesting. I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of demand in the market for parking, right? And I think one thing I'd be very interested to know is what types of projects are being proposed, approved, and financed right now in Honolulu since this 2020 reform took shape. Because if other cities are any guide, you're actually not going to see a lot of projects with 0 parking get built, precisely for the reasons that you just articulated, which is that people need to sell the units and people want a space to store their car. But some developers are making it work. And again, it's a slow process because for 70 years, we have basically eliminated from the development ecosystem anybody who does that type of small infill, cheap development that once characterized the backbone of the American housing infrastructure, right? And it's going to take a while to get that back. And so if your developers have only ever built buildings with 2 parking spaces per unit, and they've only ever sold condos with 2 parking spaces per unit, then they might not be aware of what the market is like for people who only want 1 parking space, right? So I think it is a process of discovery and a process of creation and bringing in these new builders who are willing to try new things and interested in trying new things, as well as lenders who are willing to support these experiments. And that's a slow process. I talked to people in my book who had to look to other cities to get financing for projects they were building because lenders in their own area were so skeptical of what they were doing. So it does represent a radical change to the status quo, and I wouldn't be surprised if it took some time to take
We
shape.
did pass a bill 7, it's called, it's been modified several times, where we allow projects to be very dense on acreage of 20,000 square feet with no required parking whatsoever, but it has to be affordable rentals. And there's been 7 projects that have been completed now. Others are on the books, and hopefully it'll make a difference. And I think it'll follow a little bit of the Tokyo model where you have mixed use, a lot of density, no parking, fewer cars, and more people walking on narrow streets.
I hope so.
Now, the other thing I just wanted to raise is the beach park thing. Helmwater Beach Park, most heavily used beach park in the state of Hawaii, has all free parking. And we had proposed moving the parking from the Makai side, the ocean side, to the Mauka side in an angled way so you have more parking. We had a town hall meeting down in the park. 800 people showed up. They're all pissed off. Because we were moving their parking across the street and the empties would have to walk. And the surfers would have to carry their boards. It's up. And I thought, this is all good. We're going to move the parking to the Mauka side, put in more greenscape, a bike path, a wider walking path, and huge opposition to those who park there.
Yeah, well, that doesn't surprise me terribly. But to your earlier point, I think with the construction issue, the biggest change that's happened in Buffalo since they changed these rules has been precisely in that kind of mixed-use development. Because it's a city where people do own cars and they do drive everywhere. But again, there was too much parking being built before, and in particular, that parking wasn't shared. And if you can share that parking between a commercial use like a store or a restaurant and a housing unit or an office or something like that, and that's really where you can unlock some efficiencies, even in a place where everybody owns cars. So that is happening.
Thank you. It's good. I'm glad you're here. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question is, what's next? You know, there's something around the particular momentum parking reform where several places, municipalities, states are sort of shifting, right, and just repealing the requirements, and what do you see as, the next frontier after all that happens? I'm probably a little bit optimistic as I'm seeing more of them sort of doing that, and probably it's gonna take a little bit more time to get that, out of the way, but.
I mean, I think what's next is definitely managing the curve, and I think that's true in Honolulu. I know you've discussed residential parking permits. Obviously, there's a conversation happening about paying for parking in various places. I won't say anything more about that, clearly. But this is gonna be, when we talk about, I think sometimes you hear people say things like, housing for people is more important than parking for cars. We're gonna enact policy that makes that so, right? And that's all nice to hear, but where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, forgive me, because all the metaphors are automobile focused, is actually making that decision and saying, okay, now we do have an overflow and a spillover problem, and a lot of people parking their cars on the street, and we're gonna find a way to manage that problem on the street, but we're not gonna stop building low-cost housing that doesn't require parking inside it. That's when things are gonna get really challenging. And so sometimes I do this talk for an audience that's closer to like policymakers, and I would frame this as like the 3 circles of parking hell in terms of how much opposition you will face from angry constituents. And building less parking is the easy part. Then there's, using the parking you have, sharing the parking, coming up with different uses for the existing space. And then finally, there's managing that demand through policies like pricing. And that's where things get, I think, particularly challenging, but it's important.
Okay. We only have time for 2 more questions, but please stick around. We will have a book signing after this. We have tea and baklava. We have a question here from a student who goes to UH.
Aloha. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to hear your thoughts on our controversial rail system and how it has little to no parking.
So what is the last part?
This rail system, to all I know, has little to no parking available for its users.
You mean like in the form of park and rides around the stations?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. There have been, the model for building rail infrastructure in the US for a long time has been focused around enabling people who live really far away from the system to access the stations and get on the train. And since the pandemic, there's been a lot of pressure on these agencies to turn those lots into something else, because there's just fewer people commuting to work every day because of remote work. And if you only have people going to the office 3 days a week, then all of a sudden your downtown parking supply has 40% extra capacity. And so that limit on people driving to work in the CBD is gone. And so I think the question has become, would those park and ride lots around these rail stations be better used as housing to enable people to actually live in a place where they could access the city without driving at all, or maybe even without owning a car? I think it's a really challenging question, and there are lots of trade-offs on both sides. I don't know the particulars of the planning, but I do think it's an active debate in transportation policy circles about whether it's better park and ride or transportation development.
One last question. It's going to be from Senator Chris Lee.
Thanks. Really appreciate the presentation and all the questions. Any number of places around the country have been changing their laws, as you've mentioned, here as well, thanks to a lot of, the former mayor and many others who've been doing a lot of work, and some of our colleagues. Often, though, the trickle-down effect as you get from project proposals through implementation, through all the other things, takes quite some time. And for a lot of the folks who are boots on the ground, engineers and planners and so on and so forth, in the sort of the bureaucracy, sometimes the trickling down doesn't make it all the way. Are there efforts in other places that have been successful to try and really transform sort of the internal culture for a lot of the departments and the agencies and everybody else that are trying to implement this stuff a little bit quicker?
Wow, that's a great question. That's a kind of inside baseball issue that sometimes lots of people don't really realize, is that there's this level of political action and what councils and mayors decide, and then there's your career staffers who have expectations and ideas about the way things should be done. And that often does manifest in kind of continuing the old way of doing things. I'm not really sure I know how to, answer the question of, like, I guess the question maybe is how to radicalize people who haven't really thought that hard about this issue and about whether the way that they've been doing things is the right way to do things. And I've found that the best way to do that is simply to get them on a bicycle, because I think when you ride a bicycle, you have this, you have a completely new vision of the urban environment and the way everything looks and feels, and just how much space is allocated to making sure that motor vehicles can go as fast as possible with absolutely no regard for your safety. And I think that is a radicalizing experience. And California recently passed statewide parking reform, and they did it because the state senator who had previously let this bill die in committee started riding a bike during the pandemic. And this was his radicalizing moment. And I joke that in New York, where I'm from, we need to have challenges for elected officials. And it's like, you need to walk across Canal Street on a Friday afternoon with a stroller. Like, you just have to do that before you can assume office. You need to understand what it's like, and then you can begin to make policy here. And I think that's true for riding a bike as well.
Before everyone heads out, we have one more announcement for our book raffle winner.